there is, I'm trying to look, see, okay. With that said, I want everyone to know that Dawn woke up this morning with no voice. She is on the email, she's in the chat room, and she will be adding stuff to the chat box as she deems appropriate, but she cannot speak. So today I'm going to be her advocate, and I'm going to speak her notes she sent to me this morning. So Dawn, if I don't get that correctly, please let me know and chat in, and everything will be good. So the first thing that we're doing is we talk about TAASA a little bit, which y'all know. We are a membership organization. We're a statewide organization, and we say that we are the unifying voice to eliminate sexual violence in Texas. We are a membership of rape crisis centers, advocates, survivors, and anyone else who wants to join us on this journey to foster a culture that respects the fundamental rights and dignities of all cultures. Okay. About Open Arms. Open Arms has been in the Concho Valley for 25 years. The main office is located in San Angelo, and they support the 170,000 residents of Tom Green County and 10 surrounding counties. And for people who work in rural areas like I used to, having 11 counties is kind of sort of the norm. Yes, there is, Brittany, there is audio. Other people can hear me, so please turn your sound up. And if you don't, I suggest you call in, and the number to call in at is on the top of the chat. All the numbers are there. I also want to say that this is all done via internet. So if you are having particular problems with the weather in your area, you will also find that it may affect your sound. So calling in on the phone may be a good option. All right. So going back to Open Arms, 11 counties, and their mission is to create social change within the Concho Valley by providing prevention, education, advocacy, and a safe place to foster healing for survivors of sexual violence and gender discrimination. Open Arms envisions a community that stands together against sexual violence and all forms of discrimination. I think everyone on this webinar today has something about that we stand together against abuse, violence, and all forms of discrimination. And this is what we're going to be talking about. So before we get started, I want you to take a moment, and I want you to define in your own words what you think define family violence. Just take a moment. You can either chat it in if you want, or you can jot it down on a piece of paper. Okay. And then when you're finished with that, define sexual violence. Okay, got it? I want to talk now. I'm going to start reading something a little bit about this, but before we get going, I want to tell you a little bit about me and how I came to understand interpersonal violence and how Dawn came to understand interpersonal violence. For Dawn, she was in an abusive marriage, during which time she attended a university with a major in psychology. Both of these experiences shaped for her her understanding of IPV, interpersonal violence. For me, my first understanding started with the names assigned to certain dynamics. I try not to say domestic violence because, in my worldview, there is not one thing domesticated or tamed about that term. I try to use the term family violence. I have had many aha moments since then, and most of them came fast and furiously when I started working with addicted survivors, both men and women, of sexual assault. Donna and I have tried not have tried, Don and I have based this webinar on those experiences of how we understand and what the dynamics behind the dynamics are. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the underpinnings. You can call the coercion, control, oppression, and microaggression the underlying dynamics of the dynamics of IPV. We're going to take a brief look at them because we don't have time in an hour to do a deep dive into anything, but I want to make you aware of this. And we encourage everyone to get very well acquainted with them. We also strongly state that understanding human development is essential. All right. So coercion. The first thing we talk about is a coercion. So as you can read this, I want to ask you a question. When you were a child and you were out in public, especially in church, how did the adults get you to behave? What made you comply? Think about that for a moment. What got you to comply? In my case, it was my mother either reaching out and giving us, quote, a gentle hug, which included a little pinch on our upper arm to indicate that this was not acceptable behavior, or a smile that did not meet her eyes. Oftentimes, coercion is subtle legal tactics that cannot be what do you want to say? They're legal, so you can't really document them, but they are part of a pattern of history, a pattern that tells you you're going to get it when there's no one else around. And that's coercion. Why is it coercion? Because just like in family violence, how many times do you have to apply force or beat someone up? Just once, and there you have the coercive piece of it. It's not empty words. It is something that is going to happen. All right. Okay. So control also doesn't have to be overt. Neither does isolation, as in you can't hang out with, although it does constitute that. For Dawn, she didn't spend a lot of times with the friends or family. The isolation she had was self-imposed because she was embarrassed and more troubled than it was worth to explain what was going on or anything else that she wanted to talk about. There were a lot of mind games, the degradation, the mind games. For Dawn, it was a loss of a lot of weight and bought new clothes, which her then husband helped her pick out and approved of. And by the time they got home, he was totally irritated because she had chosen a short skirt, which he had initially approved of. That can't win for doing. Micro regulation of every aspect of your life, from monitoring your phone calls to telling you how to dress or what you could or couldn't eat or what you can and cannot do, etc. Can you think of examples from your caseloads? For Dawn, again, she said the micro-regulation existed for her from the moment she woke up because she was a stay-at-home mom. He would bring me whatever he wanted her to work at, not because he needed it, but it was as a way to keep tabs on her. He timed her trips to the grocery store. just, missed calls, looking at the who the person called, who the survivor called, if they're the bill payer on the cell phone bill. Donna and I had a conversation about how we hated when all the new technology came in and it said how much time, what time you paid for the groceries and how exact change given, so that there, if you were 3 seconds late, you were accused of whatever. So this is the micro regulations that we're talking about. And these are going somewhere, okay? The oppression, all right? The personal I want to talk about is, where did the survivor, where did anyone get their personal beliefs from? Where does it come from? Where is that culture that you were getting it from? For the interpersonal racism, I'm going to use some words here. I know I'm going to offend people, and the intent is not to offend. The intent is to educate, okay? White people who tell funny racist jokes, that makes it interpersonal, especially if there's a person of color who's listening to it. Interpersonal sexism is what the perpetrator does to the victim. We call these hate crimes. Sexual abuse and harassment and violence and belittling or ignoring because a person is less than because they're in a marginalized or oppressed group. Institutional oppression is about the laws and the institutions who uphold the ideas of superiority, so they reinforce this oppression by making policies and practices and laws. One of the best things that comes to mind right now is the Jim Crow laws that existed back in the 60s, okay? And when it gets structured this way into the institution, it gives permission for individual members of the dominant group to disrespect or mistreat individuals of the oppressed group with not a care in the world, almost, with not even thinking about it. So when we are meeting clients, when we are meeting survivors, where are we meeting them? How are we meeting them? And these are the underlying dynamics of whatever else happened to them, because this is their modus operandi. Then you have the cultural oppression. Whose beauty, whose truth, whose quote right, whose idea of justice is there going to be? Because I know that when I look in the fashion magazines, people don't look like me, all right? And a lot of times that's true for a lot of people. And internalized oppression, and that happens is that the internalized oppression happens when the internalized oppression happens when you start to take in all these messages that you are given, and you believe them. And it's not just the people in the oppressed group, it's the people in the dominant group as well. And so this becomes a very, very vicious cycle. I see a message that I'm breaking up, and I apologize for that. I would suggest, again, calling in if you're doing that, because Brenda, I'm sorry about that. Okay. So what I want to say is that most people in the oppressed group don't even realize that they are being consciously oppressive. They've internalized the negative messages, and they consider their attitudes towards other people quite normal. What do you think about that? Okay. Internalized depression is sneaky. You don't realize it's happening. It's just the words are out of your mouth before you realize it, which brings us to the next set of dynamics, which are microaggressions, okay? And these are verbal and environmental slights and subs or insults that are intentional or unintentional, Okay, they are hostile, derogatory, or negative based on whatever message you're giving. And it usually starts out with you people or those people always, or I don't understand why those people live in that part of town. And if you start going back and looking what redlining was like right after World War II and maybe even earlier, you begin to understand how oppression set in. Okay, micro insults. All right, have you ever been a recipient of a microaggression or a micro insult or a micro invalidation? Okay, my pet peeve with micro insults is people not willing to learn the pronunciation of a non-English based name and then taking it and Americanizing it. This is my pet peeve, and that's just one thing. Names have meanings in people's cultures. Your mother, your father, your parents, your culture named you something, and being able to pronounce it, even if it's an American name. I've worked with people who told me, when I asked one young lady what her name was, she said, Hope. And so I asked her, I said, on this form here, you have another name? And she says, yes, my name is Esperanza, but nobody can say it. So people call me Hope or Randy. And I'm like, you could just hear the inflection in her voice as I said that. I've learned that people will come in and I will say to them, um, uh, you know, my name is Wendy. How would you like, what is your name? What would you like me to call you? And they go, my name is Sunshine, Sunshine Rainbow. Great. Do you want me to call you Sunshine Rainbow? What do people generally call you? She goes, most people call me Sunny, and you can call me that too. Is that what you would prefer? Yes, that's fine, but that avoids the micro insult instead of rolling our eyes or doing it. And the micro invalidations are very basically excluding a person's thoughts or feelings. I do this all the time with my teenage terrorist. I will say, you and your 17-year-old your 17-year-old worldview qualifies you to make, that's an invalidation, and it's not okay. People have feelings and feelings and thoughts are okay. We do it all the time. Our intentions may not be harsh, they may not mean to hurt, but I am telling you that as a communications major, the only communication that is valid is the one that is deceived. You're right. Dead naming, misgendering people is another one. Thank you, Beth. Using correct pronouns, asking people how they want to be called. One of the things that I learned when I was talking about it, you know, Beth has put some excellent comments here about clutching your purse. And the other thing is, which can be triggering, not using the correct pronouns. I learned very early on that when I was working with someone, especially if I was doing a hospital visit, I would come in and I say, hi, my name is Wendy. She, hers, and hers. She, hers, hers. And some people didn't get it, and that's fine. But the people who did get it gave them permission to say their, they, their, theirs. That is fine. We need to be, if this is a job that we have signed up for, if this is our calling, we need to be inclusive, because advocates' roles are basically to collaborate, hold space, and discuss options with the survivors. So the advocate role is to collaborate in exploration, in support, and in education to help survivors figure out what the systems are that they're going to be involved in, some information about it, and to get out of the survivor's way as they discover their path forward and they map it for themselves. That's all that advocates are there for, to go over the supportive service, to listen to the realities of their life, to ask questions of how this service would fit in with the reality of their life. Not to say, no, you can't have it because, but to say, I heard this and this provides this. How will that work for you? And ask those questions. Because advocacy at the basic level is survivor defined. It's based on survivors' needs, and it's based on their perspectives and their own cultures. Dawn sent me a list of things to say, and one of the things she has told me is, and she wrote here, is that I rarely ask the same question to every client. When I do ask questions, and we're going to have a little section on questions to begin later on, but for the most part, Dawn will say, you can tell me as much or as little as you'd like. I don't need specific details to advocate for you or for any of her clients. Okay. Then we discuss options, and discussing options basically means establishing a non-judgmental working relationship with the survivor, and that is very important. Their decisions are theirs. We can ask, I call them weather vane questions, see which way the wind is blowing for them, but that is what I ask. And then we hold space, and holding space is that part of the collaborative process. Advocates provide basic information about how violence can affect individuals, way to cope with some of the symptoms, and tips for accessing help from systems. Because part of holding space means we work with other agencies in our area to know who is there and who isn't in our community to help with. So this can mean crisis assessment, and responses, expressing empathy through reflective listening, communicating respect for and acceptance of people and their feelings. I've had people tell me when I was doing direct services, things that I was like, oh no, in my head. And I would say, wow, I never thought of it that way before. Explain that. Tell me a little bit more. I'm curious about that. And asking them, that is the not, holding space, but getting forward and saying, wow, that agency does it. How are we going to work that in with ours? So that is the holding space thing. I want to very quickly do some talking about the English language, because the English language, unfortunately, automatically puts survivors in a one-down position. The way we communicate in English is subject, verb, object. The subject are people who can act and make choices and act again. The verb tells you what they're doing, and at the end of it becomes the object, what is acted upon. All right. All right. Look at this power and control wheel. Who is at the center of this wheel? Who is the object of this wheel? It is the perpetrator. This is a very interesting perpetrator perspective, but this is not about the victim. It's what the victim, again, has suffered because they have been the subject of this wheel, the subject of language. So I'm going to tell you some things that I have found. The way we use language keeps our attention off of the perpetrator and onto the victim. This creates a culture of violence, allows for victim blaming, and again, keeps the focus completely off of the perpetrator. Dawn would say, I was in an abusive marriage. Not my ex was in an abusive marriage, or not that my ex was abusive. I was victimized by him, not the other way around. I know that this complicates some of the ways that we talk. It doesn't sound natural in English, I also understand that maybe the way we can give us a way to document that is not so one down or keeps the survivor in the object role. That's all I'm suggesting, because what it then does is it creates gaps between survivors in justice, survivors in healing, survivors in validation. And because language conceals violence, look at this, the message that we send is, it's not worth reporting. You're not worth investigating. You could be at fault. Think of some of the things that you have heard a survivor say that they were asked, whether it was by law enforcement, whether it was legal, or the criminal justice system. You know, um, how many times did you say no? Why did you go to their house? What were you wearing? You made bad decisions, and this is just a consequence of that. Is that, what do you think about those things? And how do you talk to survivors? Because we know that violence is not about what you were wearing or consequences of bad behavior, your bad behavior. It's a consequence of their bad behavior. So I'm going to talk about neutral language a little bit later on, but I want you to understand that when we are talking in English, we've got to move again from minimizing what we are saying and minimizing in terms of taking the emotional impact out of it and replacing the emotionally charged words with less charged words, like I am so dang angry, to you saying, reflecting back, I can see you're upset, and toning it down a little bit and being curious about what was said. How can they think that becomes, what information do they have that I don't? And asking that question, wow, that's interesting. Tell me about that. How can they be so irrational becomes, how are they seeing the world that this view makes sense? And so this is what needs to happen. And we're talking about that, and I'll go over that again. The other thing I want people to understand is that trauma happens in social context. This is a dynamic. And how do you think that works? Who in smaller towns has position of power? Who knows everything in smaller towns? Survivors and respond, the way the community responds is going to affect healing and disclosure in regardless of where a person is. So it has a social context to it. And the community does play a role in the survivor's healing. If we can't name it, we can't claim it. What does your community know? What kind of education do they need to make everyone feel comfortable that they are safe here? And that's a conversation to be had in neighborhoods. It is a conversation to be had with law enforcement. When my kids were younger and they were walking home from school, we had safe houses along the route so that they knew that if they were on every 3 or 4 houses, this was a safe house, somebody was home, they would help them. That kind of stuff. How do you engage the community? Okay, trauma happens to relationships. We know this. We get affected by it. It's called secondary victimization. And we know that it affects social relationships. If I came out every day and I didn't take a bath, and I never took a bath, pretty sooner or later, people wouldn't want to be around me because I stunk. And so my social relationships would start to fall away. You've been around people who have been in trauma, getting divorced or in a car wreck or whatever it is in their life, and they talk about it and talk about it and talk about it and talk about it. Why? They're trying to find an emotional place to put it in their body. They haven't incorporated it yet. And those social relationships, we don't want to invite Wendy anymore because all she talks about is her divorce. So those supportive relationships that you have with the community, with your people in your social world, begin to also reflect that. And if all you're doing at work is doing the same thing and not doing your work, it's not going to happen. It happens in familial relationships. I have heard people say after the death of a family member, it's been 2 years, can't they get over it? It's time to get over it already. No, grief has its own timeline. And with intimate relationships, the way an individual views trauma in their intimate relationship is going to dictate how supportive they're going to be. And if they don't have that view, it is not going to help the survivor move forward. If you cannot feel safe at home, if you cannot feel that you walk into your personal environment where you should feel like you're getting a hug from the environment, this is going to create all sorts of havoc in your life. And trauma happens to bodies. Right now, as far as I know, physical therapists, occupational therapists, and massage therapists are getting training in where trauma is stored, because it is not uncommon for people who touch different parts of your body in an effort to heal you will get the survivor triggered, and they react in a way that is not always nice, quote unquote. Think about a dentist approaching a survivor, not knowing they're a survivor, to put a mask over their face to give them gas because they need dental work, or approaching with a needle to stick it in their mouth to numb it. This is things we need to think about, explain to survivors, and be aware of when we're holding that space for them in the community to make everyone trauma informed. Okay, so we talk about the trauma-informed principles, which are safety and trustworthiness and choice and collaboration and empowerment. And how do you convey this to the survivor? We've got to make sure that we incorporate all of these principles. And when we don't, to automatically hold ourselves accountable and to go back and make an apology, and tell them I am accountable. Because this has been an evolution when I first started, to what's wrong with you, to what happened to you, to what is right with you. All right? Because survivors are sitting in front of you. They did something very right to get here in front of me. This took courage to sit in front of any advocate. It took courage to get here. They are survivors for a reason. So what is right? And let's build upon that. Which often means that survivors are viewed as gatekeepers. All right? Who else in their life has been a gatekeeper for them? Okay? Who has provided access or denied them access in their recent past? This is a way that we resemble the abuser. And it is very important to remember this, because if we can't, we're just going to add to the trauma of it. Okay? So we're going now into some definitions. All right. We have a definition of family violence, and the only reason I'm saying this instead of, family violence, is that this is in the Texas Family Code. This is the law. This is where it comes from. All right? I want you to look at this and compare it to what you wrote when you gave your definition of family violence. All right? How about this? Very loosely, it is a history and a pattern of intentional violence or controlling behavior. Did you write something similar to this down? And if it did not include a history and a pattern, I suggest that we start thinking, all of us, in this way: a history and a pattern. And what does that mean in legal terms? And what that means in legal terms means what it's going to mean to law enforcement and what it's going to mean to the criminal justice system. How many times must an act occur before it becomes a history and a pattern? And more importantly, does the survivor view it that way at all? All right. Okay. So everybody needs to be aware of this, that it's a history and a pattern. All right. I also want to point out, going back to the previous slide, that this comes from the Texas Family Code. That is part of civil law. Okay. Okay. Sexual assault, actually, family violence, sexual assault is used as an additional form of battering. All right. Battering is described as physically violent abuse that usually involves the act of striking someone repeatedly or heavily in order to cause injury. I want to say several words here about strangulation. It is real. It is more prevalent. Survivors don't talk about it, so it's more prevalent than we think. And it is not, for goodness sakes, please don't write choking. It is not choking. The legal term is strangulation. Perpetrators, I just came back from a training with law enforcement, and what they said is perpetrators who strangle their victims have a much higher potential for lethality, as well as committing other violent interpersonal crimes like child and elder abuse. They will use the same tactics of sexual assault, of strangulation, and of battery on everyone else. This slapping is one thing. Battering with the closed fist is something else, but strangulation is lethal. It is a lethality. Okay, I love this comment that I can't see who wrote it. Jennifer, that your mom was a massage therapist and was just sent for TIC training. I love it. Okay, so going on, here's the definition of sexual assault. Excuse me. And this comes from the penal code. The penal code means the criminal code. The criminal code, this is sexual assault. It's the criminal code. The other's in the civil code. History and pattern, look at this. Broadly defined, sexual violence is any type of unwanted sexual contact. History and pattern, it needs to be reported to authorities twice. It needs to be documented twice. That's what a history and a pattern confines of. But when we get to sexual violence, when we are talking about a history and a pattern, it may not be that it is with just this one victim. We also need to look at a history and a pattern of the perpetrator committing those offenses with other victims, and that needs to be explored. Okay, child sexual abuse. One counselor that I knew, she's retired, just when she started, noticed how many of her survivors were talking about childhood sexual abuse. So she decided to create a group for AMATs, adults molested as children, and advertised that the group was going to be given on a certain date in this community. It was a rural community serving at least 10 counties. On the appointed date and time, 200 men and women showed up wanting this group. She was overwhelmed. She was frustrated. People were crying. She didn't know what to do because there was no amount of space or time or counselors in the area to accommodate such a group. This is huge. We need to broach it. We need to talk about it. It is important to know, because what do we understand about the dynamics of child abuse is that is something people carry with them into their adulthood and makes them more vulnerable to be victims. Okay, so interpersonal violence is basically a history and a pattern of verbal, emotional, psychological, economical, spiritual, physical, and sexual abuse. The victim is being deprived of their own agencies. Okay? It is the use of the perpetrator to control or manipulate in any way that they can. It's a progression of violence. It's based on myths or people believing in myths. But what is so scary about this and the perpetrator is that this is how they manipulate the fact base. You have seen, or I don't know if you have seen, but I have seen when I worked inside of law enforcement, going to a call and the perp sitting there going, she's hysterical, you can't believe her, she's crazy, look at her, she can't talk. That's trauma talking. And they're sitting there calmly saying nothing happened. She's hysterical and pulls things out of there. So understanding this is more a peek into the perpetrator's mind again than it is into the survivors, all right? And think about at all times the manipulation that a perpetrator has with controlling the facts, okay? So complex trauma is anything and everything that undermines, demeans, or corrodes, and it's trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. You can get triggered just walking down the street and smelling some perfume or some smells that you hadn't, that the perp had used. Okay. So then here we go. The intersection of all of this, and we've talked about some of this, is the stalking. And every crime, as far as I will say this in Wendy's world, every crime starts with stalking. Every crime contains an element of stalking. You couldn't know times, dates, or rituals and routines without stalking someone. I'm not going to say anything about harassment. Reproductive coercion is controlling somebody else's reproductive choices, whether it's getting them pregnant on purpose or withholding their ability to have birth control. Whatever it is not mutual. It is somebody controlling that. And it is more pervasive than we think, and people don't talk about it, survivors at least initially, because they're embarrassed, and we need to understand that. Psychological aggression is the bullying, it's the sarcasm, it's humiliating in front of others, all right? The other thing I want to say about sexual violence, it can also include revenge porn, forced marriages, obscene phone calls, financial micromanagement. Thank you, Beth. It's there. We're going to take a look at some others right now, all right? So this is sexual assault within family. Violence increases the risk of everything else that you have seen. And what I want to say here is that people from oppressed communities, from marginalized communities, often report more symptoms of PTSS, which used to be PTSD, and significantly fewer resources or sources of social support, which increases psychological and physical effects for them. All right. So here is my nifty difty visual for you. And I am not a betting person, but I will also say that most family violence survivors have experienced sexual violence, but the reverse is not true. And I would bet on that every single time. Okay, so family violence is not about sex. Everyone's at risk. It's a lack of clear consent, clear and verbal yes, an enthusiastic yes, if you want to go into it. And consent, once given, has not been given for all eternity. Consent needs to be at every single point. Okay, that's just it. For people who consume pornography, if it is not mutually agreed upon to act out certain things with safe words and and for mutual pleasure, then it is not safe for the survivor. Okay? If there is a rape fantasy and a rape, what is the difference? Who controls the fantasy? The person who has the fantasy, and their partner agrees to go along with it. And if it gets a little out of hand, it's easy to stop. All right? Like I said, rape fantasies are fine if it's mutually enjoyable for both parties. Okay, so the effects, you've seen them, you work with them every day. I also want to include that laughing can and is a coping mechanism. It's just part of that fight, flight, or freeze or fawn complex. And think about things that you have seen that you go, what am I seeing here? It's part of the survivor's coping mechanisms. And again, I wouldn't describe perps in these terms, and I don't think they would describe themselves in those terms either. So trauma-informed care begins from the very first moment that we meet the survivor, and meeting them and trauma-informed and making sure they're safe is not enough. Trustworthiness means we trust the survivor to convey their reality to us, and we listen without trying to problem solve or offer resources initially. Let it be said in their own words. Understanding the intersections of IPV, advocates then understand that there are many different definitions for sexual violence, family violence, and that is important. Because if advocates don't work within the legal system, so we don't have to hold to legal definitions in order to advocate for survivors. We have to understand it from their point of view, and advocates then will hopefully collaborate jointly with survivors that will lead to their empowerment. So defining it and knowing what the words that they use, their vocabulary, very important. So here are some various forms of interpersonal violence that we don't talk about. Spiritual abuse, and that's using the spirituality or religion to control somebody. For children, it's being told that they are stupid for believing in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy or wanting a birthday party. But more important than that, they'll hear things like, God don't like stupid, God don't like ugly, God will get you for that. And if you grow up hearing that, what does that do to your soul and believing in your self-esteem? We talk about sarcasm and teasing, and that is harmful. If it's playful and it's mutually agreeable, that's fine. Dawn had said that sarcasm, the way she defines it, as words that cut like a knife and they're intended to hurt. What's generally said about a person who's getting teased or sarcasm is being used on when they express their dislike. It's usually done in public. And what do they hear back? Geez, you don't have a sense of humor at all, or you take things so damn literally, or I only tease you because I love you, or whatever it is. It's done in public and it's done with the intent to humiliate and to hurt you in front of others, to show that you are, that you're really not an intelligent person who has no sense of humor. Financial abuse that Beth mentioned, which I so agree upon, is controlling the ability of a survivor to acquire and maintain financial resources. It is hiding the money. It is taking their paycheck. It is threats to financially cut off the survivor because fill in the blank. It's requiring you to use your money to buy them whatever, fill in the blank. I worked with a family. It was a mom and 3 daughters. Mom's partner was a surgeon and very, very wealthy. She was a nurse. he had taken all the money and would not give her access to any of the bank accounts, nothing. And when she finally left, she had to start all over again. You know, you've heard stuff like that, but for many, many reasons, it's about power and control. But this is why, and I have seen it, and I'm sure y'all have seen it too. One of the reasons that people return to the abusive partner is because they cannot financially support themselves and, more importantly, the children. Okay. Bullying is, I call it the green Hulk, you know, hulking over. It's unwanted aggressive behavior to force someone into doing by that strength that another person has, and to indicate that they're going to hurt you. It's coercive. All right. Exploitation, using someone for your own personal gain, like making them go to work to bring you money so that you can sit around and play games or use drugs or cigarettes or whatever. It's interfamilial, and it can also be, you can think of interfamilial IVP in terms of human trafficking. Human trafficking is just not about sex. It's about labor, domestic labor and work. It's someone who doesn't have a choice in doing what they want to do with their lives. Self-neglect has always been interesting to me because people say that it is not a perpetrator who is doing this to you, it is you doing it to yourself. And I would beg you to think about it in another way. And that way would be thinking about it in terms of what the self-talk that's going through the survivor's head, the intersections of the familial abuse, the verbal abuse, the sexual abuse, about not taking themselves, not giving a bath, not drinking water, not eating, living in a bad place, etc. Sleep, when you have stuff going through your head, when you're in trauma and your body's releasing those bad neurochemicals, you don't get a lot of sleep. And if you don't get a lot of sleep, how can you be functional during the day? And that means, how can you take in information and make decisions if you cannot do that? Nutritional trauma, food's either medicine or it's poison, and it is, yes, thank you, Jennifer, for that comment. But nutritional trauma is also, if you don't have the money to buy food that your body needs and you go for the junk food because it fills you up, this is going to compromise the way you digest your food, the way you eat, the way the body uses resources. And at a time when you need to recover, where lean protein is so important, putting stuff in that doesn't, it's like putting gunk in your engine, buying gas in an awful place. Okay. Trauma-informed questions. Remember when I talked about, I'm going to breeze through here. Okay. Remember how I talked about going back here to the neutral language? This is where it comes in. And I mean it, folks. You need to start thinking about neutral language as trauma-informed questions. It's not about asking questions. This is so integral to the whole process. All right. And then coming back down here, it means that we have to shift our view because we don't see what's going on beneath the surface. When we meet clients, they're doing the best they can. So we need to be curious about why they're sitting here, how they're coping, how they got here. Tell me more about that. I am thirsty. Would you like some water too? It's such a nice day. Let's take a walk and let's talk. If they say no, fine. But it's like saying, giving them permission to saying, I need to take a break now. Whatever it is, that's what we need to do. When the bad neurochemicals get triggered, water helps rehydrate your body. Tell me more about that. So we're not asking questions, trauma-informed questions. We're asking for more information in a very neutral way that hopefully is not triggering. Okay? It means that we are shifting our worldview. Who gets to define safety? It's not us, it's them. Who gets to define self-care and well-being for them? It is them. Who defines what is helpful? It is the survivor. And how are suggestions for services made? And how do we hold the larger context of violence and oppression in our day-to-day work accountable in our, not only our agencies, also in our community and in the systems that we work with. So that's shifting our views. Okay, it's paraphrasing back what you heard and asking if you got it right. Normalizing using neutral language, open-ended and closed. When you have to ask a question, let's make sure they're open-ended, like tell me more, or that's interesting. I've never thought of it that way. Tell me more about that. All right, asking why questions sounds like you're accusing somebody of something. Leave that to the criminal justice system. No why questions. Close-ended questions are, when did that happen? So there's one answer to them. If people make a strange statement, you could say, oh, okay, I never thought of it that way. That, how are they seeing the world stuff? And education about trauma reactions and how they're important, because this helps survivors rediscover who they are, because different doesn't always equal worse. And safety has to be a realization that they have control, the survivors have control over the situation. All right, because people tend to think, and Dawn sent me this visual, they tend to think that recovery is in a straight line, and they see that other people who say, oh, I've been, it's been 5 years since I've been in my recovery. Or you might hear people who go to 12-step meetings go, I've been in recovery for 12 years. And newcomers look at them and think it's a straight line, when it really looks like a tangled weave of, loops and fallbacks and slip downs, and it doesn't matter. It matters that you're going forward, and as you move forward and you get a straight line a little bit, you may go back into that tangled weave. That is okay. That is totally okay. I've given a bunch of statistics. Dawn and I didn't want to talk merely about statistics because we both find that boring. So we did that, but I want you to know that every single day, more than 750 people experience sexual violence in this country alone. So that is a huge number. And I would say to you that out of those 570 people, I'm sorry, I transposed that. 570 people, probably 70 of them are victims of solely sexual assaults. You can see this, it starts early. I've tried to break it down nationally and how much the costs are, who does it, child abuse, national statistics. I didn't fill that in because I was trying to get abuse all together. What happens with teens in high school? Family violence for teens equates to dating violence, and if they're already getting that violence at home, this seems like normal. It seems normal. Okay, for college students, for women, for men, this is national, GLBTQ, Native Americans, people with disabilities, people of color, military, intersections of family violence and statistics in Texas. And if you are interested in getting statistics, you can go to the CDC, Statistics at a Glance. If you want Texas statistics, you can go to RAIN. I've cited it. But the IDVSA, the Institute of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault at UT Austin, has awesome up-to-date current statistics. If you want to find out what's going on in your locality, please go to the sheriff's office and ask them if they can put together the data that they have collected for the past 2 years, not for 2019, that won't work, but for maybe 17 and or 18, they can do that for you. Okay, Texas statistics are here. Also, I'm trying to speak and I'm thinking in acronyms. The Texas Council on Family Violence, TCFV, also has Texas statistics there. And violence, TAASA has some too. Feel free to look at them in the violence, but what breaks my heart here is that in Texas, 56 children enter foster care each day, and it is estimated that over 52,000 children are in the CPS system. I want to say a thing about statistics before we go. These are estimates. People don't come forward willingly and say, I was a victim or this is happening to me. So you can think about these things. It's lack of consent. It's always about power and control. It's not just happening to poor or uneducated people. It is everyone. So I always say when abuse happens, life stops and survival begins. Thank you so much. Here is the way that you can uh, get to us. Dawn and I are happy. I was happy to be Dawn's voice today. I hope I did you justice. I was trying to get the notes correct and straight. That's it. In an hour, you will be receiving a follow-up email. It will contain a link to the evaluation. It will contain a link to the post-test. It will contain a link to the PowerPoint, and it will contain a link to the certificate of attendance. Please, please, please fill them out, and we will be happy to do that because it means so much for our funders to get back this information. Thank you so much. I'm out of here. Y'all have a pleasant rest of the day. Bye-bye.